Thank you very much for that introduction. I could tell you that I don't have many slides because I want you to focus on my story, or I could admit that I am a working mother and I had to take my son to start university at the weekend, so I didn't have a lot of time. He actually started in Edinburgh, beautiful city, and it was really emotional actually to see him standing there, this tall 18-year-old looking a little bit lost, and remembering this little curly-haired boy from not very long ago who used to love reading Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus. And afterwards coming back home the last couple of days and realizing how quiet and empty the house is without all that rap music that I used to complain about. I have to say my adjustment to being empty nester wasn't exactly helped by reading on the way back from Edinburgh a review in the Weekend Times of their book of the week, which was about a student going on campus in Edinburgh and killing 13 fellow students. My son doesn't always thank me for this, but I know really firsthand how lucky he is, because I spend a lot of time in places where people really are killed for going to school. I'm a war correspondent, as was mentioned. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, where, as you know, the Taliban targeted schools over and over again, and it hasn't stopped. And just last month, there was a horrible incident where 48 students who were preparing to do the exams to go to university were in an algebra class, and a guy walked in and blew himself up and left the blackboards afterwards blood-stained and covered in bullet holes from all the ball bearings that had been in his suicide vest. And that was kids that had been sent there by parents who'd really scraped everything they had to try and give their kids a better chance in life. I don't know if it's coincidence, but we're having this today. Yesterday, as you probably know, was the anniversary of 9/11. And 17 years ago, when that happened, I went, like many of my colleagues, to Afghanistan. And when the Taliban regime was toppled after a couple of months, I was in a place called Herat, which is one of the most beautiful cities in Afghanistan, very historic, cultural city. And I went down a road which rather intrigued me because its name was Blood Bank Road, and came across the Herat Literary Society and talked to some people there about what women writers had done during the Taliban. And the president of the society took me to a little doorway, and that plaque says Golden Needle Sewing School. And these women had literally risked their lives under the Taliban to write, but they'd done it under the guise of sewing, because the only thing that women were allowed to do by the Taliban pretty much was sew. So they used to go to this school with bags full of material and sequins and things, and underneath it they had notebooks and books that they were reading, like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. They never made a single garment. If they'd been caught, they would have been locked up and quite possibly hanged. So it's quite humbling seeing people risking their lives for something that we take for granted. Sometimes when I tell people that I'm a war correspondent, I see their eyes light up, and I realize that they are under the misapprehension that it is a glamorous life. If any of you have read Evelyn Waugh's famous book, Scoop, you will have read about William Boots. Unlike him, I certainly don't travel with a humidor and a hamper and astrolabes and a trunk lined with zinc to keep the ants away. I'm afraid these days it's sort of cereal bars and EasyJet, and we wear a flak jacket which has the word press on the front, which British soldiers think is really funny to come and press. I have to tell you, it sort of loses its charm after the first few times they've done that. However, sometimes the job does feel a bit like being William Boot. I'd like to take you back to November, when Zimbabwe's longtime dictator, Robert Mugabe, had been arrested, and tanks had surrounded Parliament and the TV station, And a general had appeared on TV to announce, this is not a military coup. And so Fleet Street's finest, we all got our phone calls from our editors early in the morning to say, get to the airport, fly. And you can't fly direct to Zimbabwe, you have to fly to Joburg. So I was on the same flight as colleagues from the Mail, Independent, Guardian, BBC. As you may know, journalists have not been welcome in Zimbabwe for years, particularly British journalists. When we got to Johannesburg airport to change planes, we got the news from our foreign desk that a Times correspondent who'd got on an earlier flight had been turned back at Harare. So everyone was a bit worried, and they said to me, you've been going to Zimbabwe for years, how do you get in? So I said, well, I always go undercover. In fact, people living in Zimbabwe used to always refer to us journalists as bird watchers. And when we were calling our editors from Zimbabwe, we used to have code, one of which was to refer to Mugabe as the Yorkshireman, because Mugabe backwards is Ibagum. So anyway, so I tell them, look, I've got this fake travel itinerary, which shows me as going on holiday to Lake Kariba. I've got a Lonely Planet travel guide, and I've got a funny hat. So they all said, okay, sure. Anyway, I then go off and get coffee. I then get to the plane to do the link to Harare, and the only people on that flight, because most people were leaving, not going in, the only people were British journalists. Every single one of them was wearing a funny hat. That's me and the Mail and the Guardian. So actually, for once, it seemed like a positive story. It was actually incredible to be there on the streets of Harare with really a jubilant atmosphere as people called for Mugabe to go. And then celebrations when finally he did resign, aged just 94. So I was back there last month for elections, and also a rather bizarre press conference, I don't know if any of you saw it, of Mugabe and his wife Grace in the marble pagoda in the gardens of their very large mansion, which is called Blue Roofs because it has a blue copper roof, where Mugabe sat there and complained about the fact that his roof was starting to sag and he didn't have enough money to pay for it. How the mighty have fallen, we thought, sniggering. Election day then went ahead very smoothly, but the results were held back somewhat mysteriously. And about 3 days later, I was on the streets of Harare, where there were small protests, and suddenly Zimbabwean army arrived and started shooting people and shot dead 6 innocent people, including a mother who was just on her way home from her job in the water company. Finally, the results were announced 4 days after the election, and rather oddly at midnight. In fact, they finished announcing them at 1 in the morning, which seemed a slightly odd thing to do if you have nothing to hide. And the results showed that LO, the ruling party, which has oppressed people for 37 years and left Zimbabwe with 90% unemployment and no cash whatsoever in the banks, had been re-elected by a landslide. So nothing odd there. Anyway, so sometimes it means that my job, it's hard to be very positive about things. So even that, which had seemed like a positive story at the beginning, really then ended up being the same as I'd covered for decades. I see some really terrible things. I guess I see the worst side of humanity. I see things like girls of 16 that have been sold as sex slaves for the price of a cigarette packet. I see boys that have been kidnapped and forced into training for suicide bombers by ISIS. Just last week, I lost a friend in Kabul who was a TV reporter who'd just adopted 2 stray kittens. And he'd gone to report on a suicide bombing in a gym in Kabul. And literally, while he was live on air reporting the carnage around him, there was a second bomb and he was killed on air. And yet, I keep doing this job because in the middle of all this, you just see the most amazing people, see the most incredible resilience that people have. I call this talk The Power of the Story because I'm very passionate about storytelling and the power of narratives. In fact, I actually started off wanting to be a novelist, but the first place that I went to as a 21-year-old, this is a very glamorous picture, was Afghanistan. And I discovered that people there just had the most amazing stories I had ever heard, and I could not imagine making anything up that would be more interesting, and I wanted to bring back those stories. And I felt as though some of those places people had things to say that they couldn't get out, and that I was in a position where I could tell those stories. And I wanted to tell the stories because I wanted people to know that what happens in these places in war is much more than the bang bang and the fighting, but there are real people like us living in these situations and trying to get on day by day, and how inspired I was by some of those people. I mentioned earlier the attacks in Afghanistan in the schools, and there was one 2 years ago on the American University in Kabul, where there was a 10-hour gun battle and 16 students were killed. That university is reopened. It looks a bit like a maximum security prison now. But one of the students who I'd met, who was a survivor but had been badly injured at the time, has gone back to study there despite what she went through, and is telling other people, come and study, which I find very inspiring. The last few years, the refugee crisis has had me reporting much closer to home in Europe. And I think it's fair to say that the refugee crisis is, we've really seen the best and the worst of humanity. I would say the best is the local people, like the widows on the beaches in Lesbos in Greece, coming out, giving hot drinks and hugs and dry clothes to the people landing there. The worst was the governments refusing to take people in and erecting walls. And I suppose for us journalists covering it, the worst of all seemed to be Hungary, where they erected a 12-foot high wall. And almost exactly 3 years ago, I was there the day that they finished building that wall. And there was a whole load of us journalists on the Hungarian side. And then we heard from somebody, hey, on the other side, the Serbian side, there's this girl in a wheelchair who speaks fluent English and wants to be an astronaut. So that's like journalistic gold. So it's like, I have to find this girl. So I managed to go the other side and find her. And I couldn't really imagine, because I'd been covering the refugee crisis then for some time. It was really difficult to make that journey across Europe. So for an able-bodied person, so to do it in a wheelchair with your sister pushing you seemed phenomenal to me. So I found the girl. Her name was Nujeen Mustafa. She was just 16. She'd never before left home. She told me that she'd got cerebral palsy, and in fact, because she couldn't walk, she'd pretty much never left her apartment in Aleppo. They lived on the 5th floor, didn't have a lift or anything. And this is her. And so she had taught herself fluent English by watching American soap operas. A particular soap opera called Days of Our Lives, if you remember. And she'd learned huge numbers of things from watching National Geographic, the History Channel, and she was just fascinating. And she told me how, for example, she could list all the kings and queens of England, which I can't do, and that when she was doing the crossing from Turkey to Greece in the dinghy, which was very traumatic, it was overcrowded, you've seen the pictures of the boats, all the water coming in. And to keep herself calm, she listed all the Romanov emperors to herself. She's really a remarkable person and also very funny. And she told me that her biggest disappointment of coming to Europe was that the food didn't look like it looked on MasterChef. So She was exactly the kind of person I wanted to make people realize what it's like to be a refugee. Stalin may not be the most politically correct person to quote, but he supposedly said, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." And that's very true. As a journalist, you are always trying to find the one person that you can really make people relate to. And understand just what it's like to be in that situation. I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with another remarkable young woman, who you might recognize, Malala. And it's interesting to me, she, as you know, 15-year-old who was shot on her way back from taking her exams in her school bus. But interesting why her story has captivated people so much. Often people say to me, there's so many other young girls and boys risking their lives. What's so special about her? In fact, her own little brother is always saying to her, "What have you actually done, Malala?" And my son, who got to know her well when I was writing a book with her and we stayed with the family a lot, he used to say to me, "Mum, how has Malala got a Nobel Peace Prize? She's always fighting with Kushal." Well, I can tell you she is adorable and eloquent and very funny and passionate about what she does. So whether or not she is unique in the risks she took, she's certainly the person that I've met who's best able to use the platform that she's been given. And as you know, she's become a kind of global icon now, showing every day the power of her story to inspire other young girls and boys around the world, and also world leaders to try and change things. And she says one girl, one book, one teacher, one school can change the world. And I think she's a very strong example of how one person can make a difference. When I'm fed up with things in Afghanistan, one of my favorite places to go is this place, which is called the Guitar Girls of Kabul. And they are street kids who make a living selling chewing gum and cigarettes on the street, all of whom have lost brothers, sisters, parents in suicide bombings because they're really the most at risk being on the street every day. And yet, as I think you can see in these pictures, they just have the biggest smiles on their faces when they play the guitar. And this American, you can just see in the back, is an aging rock star, has brought them guitars and really shown the power of bringing music to people. So these are the kind of stories that I try and bring back because they give me faith in humanity. I don't know if it's coincidence that they're all women and girls. I don't know if it's because I'm a woman I look out for those kind of stories, or if it is something I believe, which is that I think women are the real heroes in war situations because they're the ones that have to feed and protect and educate their children when all hell is going on around them. And I've seen in all of these places, we all want the same for our children, wherever we are, and that there's much more that unites us than divides us. You also see when you're in places like this, that in conflict zones, that the small things that preoccupy us in everyday life really don't matter. Things like trains running late. These girls, one of them said to me that her biggest joy was finding a yellow flower in the rubble one day. And that just seemed like such a metaphor to me, that always trying to find the yellow flower in a difficult situation. So I just want to end with actually a few words from a poem that a friend sent me earlier this week, which I think is a pretty good mantra for a storyteller. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it. Thank you.